Thank you very much for the introduction. Probably not any time for the talk after that. The presentation, as mentioned, will talk about some of the technological developments, and I'll preface this by saying that many of the things I'll talk about are not common to Siemens, are not exclusive to Siemens, but are available from all of the vendors that produce PET-CT scanners. Some of the features are unique, but on the whole, many of these are available across the industry in general. So for those of the audience that are not from a medical physics background or a PET physics background, just a very quick recap of how PET imaging is done. Essentially, positron emission tomography involves the injection of a positron-emitting radionuclide. That patient is then put onto a bed into a detector ring within the field of view, and we're able to capture those incident photons. Through the decay, as the protons are released, they annihilate with an electron, and two 511 keV photons are given off at 180 degrees to each other. And from that, we're able to build up an image. So areas of increased activity are essentially able to be demonstrated on the scans. The other thing to note here is that PET scanning is about 90% of the time used for oncology imaging, and the remaining 10% is made up of cardiac and neurology imaging at the moment. So just to go back over the last couple of decades and some of the major technological improvements, and what I'll talk about here are advancements in the technology that have improved things like sensitivity or have been able to bring down the time. But at the same time, this has contributed to being able to reduce the injected radiation activity and therefore patient dose. Now, there's always that corresponding decision to be made on injected dose versus scan time, and we can always inject more dose and scan for a shorter time, or we can inject less dose and scan for a longer time for a given image quality. In reality, what we're seeing in clinical practice is that there is improvements in image quality, but we're also seeing a corresponding decrease in dose in most cases, and I'll give some examples of that later on. So BGO systems were sort of commonly commercially available in the early 1990s. There were systems prior to that, but the first really commercial scanners in PET scanners were available around that time. We saw the introduction of LSO-based scanners in the late 90s, and then around the turn of the century we saw a really big change with the introduction of CT scanners, so another modality which enabled us to better anatomically localise where we were seeing tumours in the body or lesions, and we also used that for attenuation correction. Early 2000s we saw an expansion in the fields of view. Time of flight imaging came in around 2010, and in the last couple of years we've seen a significant improvement with the introduction of silicon photomultiplier detectors, which replaced the PMT or photomultiplier systems that were available previously. So to go into a few of the features that actually have contributed to potential dose reduction, and in the top line there you'll see many of the technological advancements that are specifically related to the PET side, and then I'll talk a little bit more later on about some of the CT advancements. So crystal selection, BGO systems that were available earlier on, and you saw from the earlier slide that scan times were very long. They were up to an hour or more than an hour to scan patients on these earlier PET scanners. One of the challenges of BGO crystals, or the bismuth germanate oxide crystals, was that they had very good stopping power, but the light output wasn't fantastic, and there was quite a long decay time, so around 300 nanosecond decay time, compared to lutetium crystals that only had a 40 nanosecond decay time, which meant we were able to detect photons much faster, and as a result we were able to get much more information from the scanner, and as a result reduce injected activity for the same image quality. It also enabled the introduction of features like time of flight imaging due to the speed of the crystals as well. Extending the field of view was another improvement that contributed to the possible reduction in injected activity. So you can see here the difference of around about a 30% increase in the field of view. And what we see is that the lines of response, or the ways that the scanner can see the information as these photons are emitted. With the example on the left hand, a single row of crystals, you'll see that there is only one line of response available. As you increase the number of crystals, then the count rate increases proportional to the square of the number of detector rings. So a 30% increase in the number of detector elements actually leads to a more than 70% higher increase in count rate performance, so much higher sensitivity. And this has had a significant impact, and you'll see this later on. Time of flight. Now, the two photons that are emitted fly off in opposite directions at the speed of light, and we're able to actually measure the difference in time from one photon hitting one side of the ring to the other side of the ring. So a photon coming from the middle of the ring will hit simultaneously, and the timing resolution of the system, so the ability to determine the time difference of these two photons, enables us to better localise along that line of response where the event came from, and that improves the contrast in the images. So to use an example of the most current SIPM-based detectors on the bottom of the slide there, with a timing resolution of around 214 picoseconds, compared to the current PMT-based technology of the Siemens scanner here of 540 picoseconds on the MCT scanner, we can narrow down to within an 8 centimetre block of tissue where that event came from, which enables us to much more clearly define the area that the activity is coming from, or in this case, where the tumour is coming from. With a 240 picosecond scanner, we're able to narrow that down to within about a 3.2 centimetre block. And to just give you a clinical example, here's a brain scan done at 540, and here's one done at 214 picoseconds. And even to untrained medical people, you can very clearly see the difference between the clarity of the image here and here. So we don't have to utilise all of that improvement in speed and image quality, but we can also reduce the dose that we inject and have still a significant improvement in image quality through the improvements in time of flight and sensitivity. HD PET, or point spread function, so annihilations that happen right in the middle of the field of view always hit the crystal's end on, and we can see exactly whereabouts that information came from. As we get closer to the edges of the field of view, because of the energy of the photon, it'll often travel through one or two crystals, and that gives us an incorrect line of response, which means that the resolution and also the contrast towards the edge of the field of view can drop away. So measured point spread functions enable us to improve the localisation and the image quality essentially out towards the edges of the field of view for the same dose. Some of the features that start to bring in CT now a little bit, so PET-guided examinations, traditional PET-CT examinations start with a CT scan that is used to determine an overview scout, essentially. In this case, we can actually do the PET scan first of all, and in this case, you can see a lesion in the patient's chest, and afterwards just go back and do the CT scan over the area of interest rather than scanning the entire body. So it provides a great opportunity for a reduction in radiation exposure for the patient. Another feature, smart neuro attenuation correction. So we use the CT scanner to create a mu map, which is then used for attenuation correction on conventional PET-CT scanners. The smart neuro AC feature essentially allows us to use an atlas-based image for neuroattenuation correction, particularly in the brain, because changes in body habitus don't have the same effect in the head as they do in other parts of the body. So it allows us to take away the CT altogether in these cases. Another feature that's been available for the last couple of years is a feature called flow motion this is on the Siemens scanners, which is a continuous bed motion acquisition for PET. And traditional PET-CT scanning, we take an image using the field of view on the detector, and then the patient moves down, we take another image, the patient moves down, we take another image, and then those images are summed together at the end. The CT scan that we do is essentially matched to the field of view of the PET scanner. So looking at the traditional acquisition methods of step and shoot, to use the term, you can see in this patient with a head and neck tumour, we have to do an over-irradiation of the chest, even though we're not interested in that part of the body, to match it to the images from the PET scan. With flow motion, we can essentially define the exact starting point and the exact finishing point that we're interested in having a look at. So it reduces the overscan where bed positions don't match up perfectly with the area of interest that we're looking to scan. I talked earlier, or briefly mentioned earlier, about the changes in detector technology, and this has had a significant improvement in the ability or the potential for radiation dose reduction. So on the left we have an indication of a traditional PMT-based system, and on the right an indication of a new silicon photomultiplier detector. So just to run through how it works a little bit, the gamma ray hits the crystals. That crystal converts to light. In the case of a PMT-based system, there's a light guide that proportionally distributes that across the PMTs, so we can determine whereabouts and which crystal that photon hit. And then once that photosensor's captured the light, it's turned into an electronic signal and then built into an image. In the case of the SIPM-based system, there is a direct conversion, and with the detectors in our current model systems, there's 100% coverage of that crystal block. So we don't lose any of the counts and we don't lose any of the sensitivity. And we're also able to cut the crystals much smaller, which improves our spatial resolution on the scanner. So just to give you an idea of the impact that that's had on dose, potential dose, and this example is using a fairly standard dose of 10 millicurie or 370 megabecquerels. And if we follow the scan time up here, so the 10 millicurie dose, the scan time for that would be around about 5 minutes. Looking at, and this is on a whole body scan or a 70 centimetre field of view, if you follow that 10 millicurie line back, you can see that it's possible to scan that patient in around about 1.5 minutes to get the same level of image quality. Conversely, if we come down the line and we use the same 5-minute scan time, we could inject around about 3 millicuries of dose to get the equivalent image quality we'd get from a 10 millicurie dose scan. So the reality in clinical practice is that people don't want the same image quality, they want slightly better image quality. But what we're seeing in some of the first sites that have installed these systems is that initially we're seeing around about a 30 to 40% reduction in injected activity with a still significant increase in image quality. And this article is from the current JNM, published this month from one of the early adopters in Groningen in the Netherlands, where they showed exactly that the activity concentration or administration could be reduced by a factor of around 3 using standard clinical reconstruction methods. We have 2 of these systems installed in Australia at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, and they've found very similar results. They've reduced their injected activity by around about 30 to 40% and seen significant improvements in image quality. So from what I've gone through and some of the technological advancements, we've seen that PET sensitivity or effective sensitivity has increased by around a factor of 20. Scan times have decreased by a factor of around 20. And with reconstruction improvements, we've also seen improvements in image quality. So what has all this actually done to decrease injected activity? And we looked at, well, anecdotally, I guess we're hearing information that doses are getting smaller or injected activity is getting smaller, but that's typically coming from Europe, Japan and Australia. But a JNM article in 2015 was showing activity injections in the US somewhere around about 13.7 millicurie. Now that didn't gel 100% with what we were seeing, so part of the remote servicing feature is that sites can report the activity that they inject as part of their scans. And we were seeing an average around about 7 millicurie injected doses, which is at odds with what we were seeing in the literature. There was also a report, 2012 IMV report, which reported exactly the same sort of number from the US, around about that 13.7, which is just over 500 megabecquerels. So this is a histogram showing overall MCT doses. Now, to be fair, it is slightly underrepresenting the US data, but here we see that average doses globally around about that 7 millicurie range, which is around about 260, 250 megabecquerels. Most sites sort out or decide the injected activity based on patient weight, but this is taking into averages across all systems. But if we break that out and look at it on a regional basis, we see that we were seeing much higher doses in the US compared to Western Europe, for example, and the rest of the world coming in only slightly higher, around 7.6 millicurie injected activity. So looking at what impact has some of these technological advances made on the injected activity we're seeing around the world, interestingly in the US not much for the addition of the additional ring, but in Western Europe we saw a reduction of average doses from around about 11 down to around about 8 millicurie initially. Looking back at previous detector technology, so the TruePoint systems which were pre-2008 to post, we saw a slight reduction, around about 17% in this case. Time of flight, again a very similar number, about a 17% reduction from systems that were time of flight capable compared to non-time of flight. And then comparing, again, US to the rest of the world here, we see that there was a similar reduction, so around about a 1 millicurie reduction in injected activity, albeit at from a slightly higher base. And then this is dose profiles across all regions, so sort of breaking it down by the regions. Now, one of the things that people might mention is, well, Japan, you'd expect lower doses with, on average, smaller body size compared to North America. But if you look down at the lower end, Germany and Southwest Europe don't have significantly different sized patients compared to the US, but we are still seeing significantly lower doses there. There's been certainly some significant improvements. I was in the US a couple of weeks ago at one of the sites, and they have started to reduce their injected activity from around about that 12 millicurie range down to around about 9. And there was, I think it was mentioned in a talk on effective dose just before the last break, that an ICRP report that came out in the last couple of days has shown about a 20% reduction in medical radiation doses over the last decade. So we're expecting to see that to continue to come down. So what about the CT part of the PET-CT? Just to quickly run through some of those features, there has been improvements certainly in the detector efficiency, so changes in detector material on the CT scanners has enabled doses to come down. Previous technology meant that if we wanted to do an attenuation or a low dose attenuation correction, scan for attenuation correction, and then we wanted to add a diagnostic CT, you had to repeat the diagnostic portion of the CT. There's now the option to be able to incorporate the higher dose portion of the scan into the lower dose whole body scan. Dose modulation, which was mentioned in one of the earlier talks in this session, has the effect of being able to significantly reduce dose because the tube is modulated on the fly, and this is available from all vendors. It's not a unique feature. Improvements in tube design now enable us to use much lower KVs, down to 70 KVs, and pediatric specific protocols, being able to reduce the dose there. This is a nice feature. So with the advent of greater Z-axis fields of view on the CT scanners, you need to do about 180 degrees of scanning before you can start to reconstruct an image. I'll just go back and replay that. So you can see that there was an over-irradiation at the start and the end of the desired scan range. The insertion of a collimator in front of the patient meant that we could block out that half a rotation of radiation to the patient at the start and the end of the spiral. Iterative reconstruction techniques have improved significantly over the last few years, and we've seen about a 60% reduction from the initial systems. We were able to get much lower dose but improve the image quality using multiple iterative reconstruction loops in the raw data and the image space. And then what about other technologies? So We've got PET-MR systems that were introduced around about the time 2011, the first commercially available systems. No CT dose at all because we're using an MRI scanner instead, and the increased field of view improves the sensitivity and enables the option to reduce dose. And a paper here from 2014 that showed about a 70% reduction compared to PET-CT. And another one that talks about the fact that MRI sequences run a little longer than, or run for a longer period of time, but we're requiring PET data the entire time. So you don't need to inject anywhere near the activity to be able to get the same image quality on the PET-MR scanner. And finally, just to talk about the staff, I mean, a lot of the things I've spoken about are specific to patient doses and improvements for patient dose. But there's some features that have been introduced. So at the moment, quality control needs to be done on a daily basis using a germanium source that the staff need to put onto the scanner. There's a feature called Quality Guard that we've recently released, which uses the inherent radiation from the lutetium crystals to do daily QC, which means that the staff don't need to use the external phantom. And that just calibrates itself overnight. It's essentially background radiation that's inherent in the crystals and corrected out in the reconstructions. One of the questions that people have asked is whether or not these need to be replaced from a QC perspective. The half-life of lutetium is around 39 billion years, so it's unlikely to cause an issue in terms of the life of the PET-CT scanner, or the life of anyone for that matter. So it does contribute to a reduction for staff dose. Another recent feature, this one was just released at the EANM meeting in Barcelona a few weeks ago from our perspective, but is also available from other vendors, deviceless gating. So previously staff would need to set up a respiratory gating belt to measure the respiratory input, and we'd then use that to correct for motion. We're now able to use the list mode data from the PET scanner to correct. And finally, automatic injectors, nothing to do with the PET-CT scanner itself, but here's a couple of systems that are available on the market where staff are no longer required to hand inject patients and can dispense multiple isotopes, so gallium-68 PSMA for prostate cancer or FDG for general oncology imaging, and do it with so that the injector's loaded once at the start of the day, and then there's no intervention from the staff after that. So just in summary, the improvements in technology provide a potential to reduce injected dose, but that implementation is very region dependent at the moment. The full impact of the improvements have not been realised because the improvements in image quality are something that the clinicians want. So we are seeing a reduction in injected activity, but on the whole we're also recognising the benefits of the improved image quality as well. Interestingly, that European, Australian and Asian sites are using just a little over half of the injected activity relative to the US. The Z-axis field of view has certainly been appreciated in those regions for reducing injected activity. Time of flight, about a 10% reduction across the board. And then the improvements in CT technology have had a significant improvement in dose to patients. From a Siemens Healthineers perspective, we are involved in a number of dose reduction task force with the Society of Nuclear Medicine and the Medical Imaging Technology Alliance in the US as well, which is where we manufacture these systems. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. We have one question that's come in on the app. Considering how dramatic the dose can be reduced with some advancements as shown, do regulatory authorities have a responsibility to implement this even where there is an additional cost burden?
Good question. One of the challenges that we find when PET technology is not inexpensive, it's and in Australia it's quite closely regulated by the government in terms of the availability of the service. So in order to have a license to get reimbursement for PET-CT, you need to have surgery, oncology services and so on site or near site. And not all indications are even reimbursed. That's different in different parts of the world. But in terms of the regulatory authorities, I guess, dictating the need, It's a bit tough, I guess, as an equipment vendor to be able to answer that. I mean, we'd love them to. It'd be fantastic if everybody had to have all these technologies because it'd enable us to provide them. But I mean, I think on the whole, many of these are available on current model scanners. And one of the things in Australia, again, is that we have a capital sensitivity rule that Medicare has in place, that scanners that are more than 10 years of age, the reimbursement drops by 50%. So that I guess, incentivises imaging providers, both public and private, to update their equipment, you know, on that sort of 10-yearly basis, or do a significant upgrade. And some of these features qualify as a significant upgrade, and that only extends that life by five years. So yeah, we typically see that the technology life cycle will drive a lot of sites to replace the equipment.
Thank you. There's also a question, is the reason that the higher dose for US, that the US patients are heavier than others?
Well, initially I thought that, but then I had a look at the histogram, and you know, I think some of the German patients, and you know, are of a very similar size, you know, or European patients aren't significantly bigger. What I think contributes to that, there's a number of things. One is that many of the US sites are looking for higher throughput, so they're trying to scan the patients faster. As a result, just continue to use higher doses. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't really know why the US doses are higher, but I do see them coming down, but it's taken a little while for some of these technologies to take hold.
Can I just follow up on that then? Do you think you as an equipment manufacturer, do you have any role to play in trying to get the injected dose reduced somewhere like the US, or is that really should be down to the local users?
I think we do have a role to play through education. So, you know, many of the slides that I've used are something that we talk about when we're presenting these systems to potential customers. And we do focus a lot on potential dose reduction as well as the improvement in the image quality, and people are much more cognizant of radiation dose than what they were probably 5-10 years ago. So I think it is through education.
Great, I think that's good to know. We have no more questions on the app. Are there any questions from the audience on the floor?
Lunchtime.
No, okay. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation.